Welcome everyone to Pathways Through the Orchard, Parshat Tisa. We have many insights tonight. We're going to start the Parsha is somewhat divided. The first half of the Torah portion is more about the Mishkan. Many different things about the Mishkan, including also the idea that making the Mishkan does not override Shabbat. That's an idea that's repeated a number of times in the Torah. And then the second half is the whole incident of the golden calf. So it's pretty much divided in half. So tonight, I'm going to do just one part of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and the other insights will all be connected to the incident of the golden calf. So we're going to start with the ketoret, the incense, that in the last week's parsha, Ki Tisa, the end of the parsha was about the altar for the incense, but it doesn't really explain the incense. It's more about the altar. And in this week's parsha, it's about the anointing oil that had different herbal essences in it, and the ketoret. And so the first insight will be about ketoret, the incense in the temple. When people would go to the temple, probably the two most tangible, tactile experiences was the smell of the incense and the music that was being provided by the Levites for many of the different offerings. And so when a person would go, along with, in the first temple, the presence of the Shekhinah, God's divine presence. But again, from a tactile, it was the music and the smell of the incense. The Mishnah says that the smell of the incense in the temple wafted all the ways down to Jericho. I don't know exactly how many miles away it is or kilometers, but I'm just going to guess, let's say 20, 25 kilometers. They said that you could smell the incense in the temple all the ways in Jericho. So all the more so if you were in the temple. And by all accounts, it was a heavenly smell, a very elevating experience, just smelling the incense, just like, let's say you smell a rose. So that's only for a couple seconds, but here it was all encompassing. So in the sanctuary, there were basically four elements, four instruments, we'll say. You had the Aron Kodesh, the holy ark that was within the Holy of Holies. And then outside, there were three things. The menorah was on the south. The showbread, the table of the showbread, was on the north. And the Holy of Holies was towards the west. And on the east was the ketoret. So it's almost like a diamond shape. You had the Aron, and then the showbread and the menorah, and then the incense. So it was like a triangle. And so according to Kabbalah, these represent, the Aron represents Keter, the menorah is Chachma, the showbread is Bina, and the incense is Dat. So these are the higher sphirot that are in the sanctuary. They're represented in the sanctuary. And so the first temple had what was called the presence of the Shekhinah, the divine presence. And the Shekhinah is the feminine aspect, as it were, of God, even though God literally doesn't have a masculine and feminine part, but in terms that we can understand, the Shekhinah is the more feminine, and what's called the Holy One, blessed be He, is the more masculine. And so the whole Mishkan was a vessel for the Shekhinah, for Israel to experience the divine presence. And so the whole experience of the Mishkan was a very, very receptive, feminine kind of energy. And so there's a beautiful idea that we're going to explore it more later, the connection between the Mishkan and the Garden of Eden, where in the Aron, the two Kruvim that were facing each other, this is the image of Adam and Eve before the sin. And the whole atmosphere of the Mishkan, especially according to the Ramban, was an attempt to capture both the giving of the Torah and the idea of the Garden of Eden. The two luchot were in the Holy of Holies, and the Torah is called the Tree of Life. Eitz Chaim Hi. So we have the idea of the Mishkan as representing both the Garden of Eden and the experience at Sinai of receiving the Torah. And so there's according to tradition, there are three special mitzvot that are applicable to women. Three special mitzvot that women do. And that is what's called challah, that they take the tithe of challah. When you make a certain amount, approximately 2 kilo, you have to take a part for the Kohanim. And it's still done, even though we don't give it to the Kohanim now. But this mitzvah was especially given to women. And then there is hadlaka, is lighting candles. That's why it's customary for women to light candles to usher in Shabbat and the holidays. And the laws of nida, of family purity. These were the three mitzvot given to women. And here we see a beautiful idea that the menorah is the hadlaka, that in the sanctuary there was the menorah that had to be lit every day. So this corresponds to women lighting candles. The table of the showbread, so this is obviously connected to the mitzvah of challah. And these are obvious. The one that needs a little thought is the connection of the ketoret to nida, to family purity. And we're going to explain that because, again, keter is across from dat in the sfirot. Keter is above, and right below it is dat. But in the Mishkan, it's more horizontal. Keter, and across from keter is dat, is the Aron and the ketoret. And in the Midrash, the Holy of Holies is related to the bedroom. Is here we have the two kruvim, and we're told that when we were doing God's will, the kruvim could be seen in a love embrace. And they're behind the curtain, in like a private, intimate place. And so the Holy of Holies is sometimes referred to as the bedroom. And across from it is the incense. So now it makes sense that the incense would be connected to the woman's mitzvah of nida. So again, I'm just going to review this quickly. The three mitzvot of women are lighting candles, that is the menorah, and taking challah, taking a portion of bread when you make a certain amount, that is the 12 loaves of the showbread. And nida is connected to dat, which is connected to ketoret. So why do we say that ketoret is connected to dat? So as we said, just like the two luchot in the Holy of Holies represent the tree of life. So across from the tree of life is Eitz Hadat, Tov V'Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So now we can understand why the altar, the incense, is right across from the Aron, because it represents these two trees. And Eitz Hadat, the tree of knowledge, and the first time that the word dat is used as a verb is, first it's used as a noun, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But when it's first used as a verb, it's the Adam yada et Chava ishto. And Adam knew his wife. And we're told that that's a euphemism for intimate relations. So that's the connection with nida and dat. And since the incense is representing the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we see something very interesting, that there's two main stories in the Torah where ketoret, incense, was used and it led to death. The first one is with Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, who take incense into the Holy of Holies without being commanded to on the day that the tabernacle is inaugurated. And we're told that God just took their souls just left them. And the second incident that has to do with incense is with Korach. When Korach and his group rebel against Moshe, so Moshe set up a test. Bring incense, and we'll see whose incense God chooses. Korach and his followers, or Aaron. And again, the whole rebellion ended up with the earth swallowing Korach. And then when a plague breaks out in the camp, so Moshe says to Aaron, take incense and go into the camp, and that will stop the plague. So here we see a very paradoxical idea, that just like Eitz Hadat, Tov V'Ra, incense, it can lead to death and it can save life. And so here you have the opposites of life and death, of good and evil, connected to incense. And so incense was a very, very powerful spiritual tool, but it had to be guarded very carefully. It was forbidden to make up the formula of the incense and use it any place but the temple. Only in the temple could you use the incense. So here we just see the life and death, good and evil kind of energy that incense has, and it's connected to dat. It's also interesting that there were 11 spices that made up the ketoret. And we know that we usually talk about the 10 sfirot. But it's only 10 when you count either Keter or Dat. If you would count both of them, you actually have 11 sfirot. And that's why, depending on the system, if you're counting Keter, you don't count Dat. If you count Dat, you don't count Keter. But together, they equal 11. And that's the exact amount of spices that were in the Ketoret. Now, the Ketoret, of course, had this incredible smell. And there's this concept that the offerings in the temple were a good smell for God. Reach nichoach, a pleasant, sweet smell for God. And so Rashi explains, of course, we're not talking about a physical smell, but what is it talking about? And so Rashi says the good smell is God says to Israel, I command and you fulfill. When you fulfill my will, that is the reach nichoach. That is the good smell. So when we do mitzvot, in the temple, it was the offerings. But we expand it when we do mitzvot and we do God's will, that is a sweet smell for God. So there's an amazing Rashi that has to do with Ketoret, because on the day that the Mishkan is dedicated, the princes of the tribes, each day one tribe would bring gifts. And they actually were all the same gifts. This is in Parshat Naso in the book of Bamidbar, the second Torah portion of the book of Numbers. And it tells us in great detail about these gifts. And one of the gifts was Ketoret. Ketoret was brought as a gift for the Mishkan. And so Rashi there says, if you take the word Ketoret and you take the kuf of Ketoret, the first letter of Ketoret, and you switch it in the mystical alphabet called Atbash, where you take the first letter and exchange it for the last letter, the second letter for the second last letter. So kuf is the fourth last letter, and it corresponds to the fourth letter in the alphabet is a Dalet. So Rashi says if you take the kuf from Ketoret and you exchange it with the Dalet, the gematria of Ketoret becomes 613 and represents all of the mitzvot, the good smell of all of the mitzvot from, as it were, from God's perspective, that he commands us 613 mitzvot. And when we do God's will, it's a spiritual good smell for God. So one last connection. We're in the month of Adar now. And it's interesting that the two main Jewish figures are Mordechai and Esther. And so the sages say, let me back up a little bit, that according to tradition, we call her Esther, but her Hebrew name was Hadassah, which comes from the bush, the spice, the good smell of Hadass. Hadass is one of the four types that we take at Sukkot time. One of the four arba minim that we bring together and we shake on Sukkot is Hadass. So Esther's Hebrew name was a name of a good smell. And then they ask, where is Mordechai hinted to in the Torah? And so it's actually in this parsha where the myrrh is in the Aramaic is called Moradachia. That's the myrrh spice. And Moradachia sounds like Mordechai, Moradachia, Mordechai. So the sages found an allusion. But it's interesting that both of the heroes of the story of Megillah in the month of Adar are both connected to this good smell. And then there's one other very deep connection with the concept that the Ketoret represents Da'at, and especially the Eitz Da'at Tov V'Ra, as we've explained. So we already mentioned that when we count Keter as part of the 10 Sefirot, we don't count Da'at. And when we count Da'at, we don't count Keter. And so we're told because they're like two sides of the same coin. But Keter is more supraconscious, and Da'at is more conscious. So the idea all year long, in a certain way, we're trying to draw Keter into Da'at. We're trying to draw supraconscious, this high elevated spiritual consciousness into normative reality, into Da'at. And so on Yom Kippur, we actually do the opposite. On Yom Kippur, we take incense and we go into the Holy of Holies, which represents Keter. So the whole year, in a sense, we're trying to draw Keter into Da'at. But on Yom Kippur, we're bringing Da'at into Keter. So this is very much connected to the holiday of Purim, because we're told that the idea of Purim is to reach this level called Ad Lo Yada, until we don't know. We don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. We get to a place where we can see the absolute unity. We can see everything coming from God. We see how the Eitz Da'at Tov V'Ra is, as it were, it was like the two sides of a triangle. But when they come into the Aron Kodesh, when they come into the Holy of Holies, then we can see the oneness. And that's the idea of the consciousness of Purim, is to see how ultimately good and evil all are unified in divine providence. And so in the Zohar says an amazing statement that in the Torah, we don't call it Yom Kippur. It's always Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonement, but it's in the plural, Kippur, Yom HaKippurim. So the Zohar says it, read it, that Yom Kippur is a Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim. And so here, like I said, the whole year, we're trying to draw from Keter into Da'at. But on Yom Kippur, we need to take Da'at and elevate it back into Keter, into this holy supraconsciousness. So these are many, many ideas about the Ketoret and found in this week's Torah portion. Okay, now we have a number of insights that have to do with the golden calf. And in a sense, they're separate insights, but they're all connected. So hopefully, time permitting, I'll be able to get through all of these insights and tie them together. So first of all, there's a general idea that the laws of science, the natural laws through which the universe works, have parallel spiritual laws. And this is a very deep subject in of itself, but every scientific law has a corresponding spiritual law. And so here we're just going to look at gravity. And the law of gravity is if you throw a ball up in the air, it will come down. If you jump, you'll reach bottom. This is just a law of the universe, the laws of gravity. So spiritually, we have the same idea that if we go up spiritually, it's inevitable that there will be a fall. This is just the laws of nature. And we see it all over the place. But in this week's Parsha, what we see is this is connected to the idea of a question which we'll get to later also, but how could it be that the same people that experienced the 10 plagues, experienced the splitting of the sea, water from a rock, bread from heaven, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and 40 days later, they're worshiping a golden calf? A question that's asked by commentators in every generation. So we see just in general, the experience of receiving the Torah at Sinai was like the epitome of a high experience, of a spiritual, mystical elevation of soul. In fact, we're told that our souls became so elevated that they left our bodies. It was such a awesome experience. Our souls could barely stay in our bodies. And the Midrash says that, in fact, our souls did leave our bodies, and God sent angels to revive us, to bring the soul back into the body. And so here, there's this high. Moshe Rabbeinu is up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And in the Gemara, it's compared to Moshe going to heaven. And so the golden calf, what it's pointing out is this high. It's almost built into it. There had to be like a fall, a descent. Now, if there's a circumstance where a person on purpose elevates themselves with the idea that whatever I learned from this elevated experience, this spiritual experience, I'm going to bring it back down and integrate it into my life, then the ascension and descension is a very positive thing. But here, it wasn't like planned out. It was just the spiritual laws of the universe kicked in. And this is what we call run and return, ratzo v'shov, that the soul runs, but eventually it must return. And this is the secret of what's called arba shenichnasu lepardes, the 4 that entered into the orchard. This is Rabbi Akiva and 3 of his contemporaries. And after years of spiritual preparation, they elevated their souls to a very, very, very high level. But Rabbi Akiva warned them, and he said, when you get to the place of pure marble, meaning when you get to this clear vision of godliness, don't say water, water. In other words, when you get to this level of a divine vision, you're also going to be confronted with paradox, because the essence of God is the ability, what's called, to hold opposites. Our whole world is full of opposites. Everywhere we go, right behind me, we have pictures of the Magen David, where we have one triangle going up and one triangle going down. That represents all the opposites in the world. But in heaven, there are also opposites, but these opposites are totally unified. So Rabbi Akiva warned them, when you get to the place of pure marble, don't say water, water. And they say that only Rabbi Akiva went in peace and came out in peace. One became a heretic, one died in the process, and one lost their mental bearings. But they say the reason that Rabbi Akiva came out in peace is because before he even elevated his soul, he knew that the purpose was to bring whatever he would experience back down to practical reality. So here's an example where the law of gravity is in a spiritual sense is not a bad thing. But sometimes, and probably everyone has experienced this numerous times, where we go from ecstasy, or we go from a state of joy, or a state of accomplishment, or purpose, and then we have this fall, an emotional, psychological fall. So that's what we're talking about here. So here we just see it's a simple dynamic that we're seeing here, that after the high of Mount Sinai, that unless the people were totally prepared for the fall, and the fall was when they thought Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to come back, he didn't come back exactly when they thought. And it turns out it was just a misunderstanding. And so after 6 hours, we'll get into this more, they were already looking to make a golden calf. They experienced this tremendous fall. Like, where is Moshe? What's going to be? Who's going to lead us? And so they had this tremendous fall, and the golden calf became the way they thought they were going to solve their instability. But here again, this idea of run and return. So we have a concept that's called Yerida L'Tzorach Aliyah, going down in order to go up. This is actually the story of our whole lives. Our souls come down into our bodies, and the purpose is that we should, through the soul being in the body, that we should rectify and refine and improve and experience something that the soul would not be able to experience only in the spiritual realms. And so this is what's called a descent in order to ascend. But then we have the opposite. And this is the story of the 4 that went into the Pardes. To ascend in order to descend. In other words, as long as it's on purpose, then the coming back down does not have to be a negative thing. So Rav Ginsburg explains very beautifully that in the book of Devarim, we have a mitzvah that if you build a new house, you have to make a guardrail around the roof so that the fallen one will not fall off the roof. And so Rashi explains, what does it mean the fallen one won't fall off the roof? And he explains that the person that we're talking about here is someone either through fate, destiny, divine providence or the choices that they made and the consequences, that they are bound to fall off a roof. So Rashi says we're commanded to make a guardrail around our roof so there won't be blood on our hands. And so Rav Ginsburg explains, well, if going up to the roof is such a dangerous thing, and we're talking about spiritually, going up to the roof represents a spiritual ascent. You go up to the roof and now you can see 360 degrees in every direction. You get new insight. You have a new perspective. But if going up to the roof is so dangerous, and Rav Ginsburg says, because it's inevitable that we will fall. But the question is, how do we fall? So he says very simply that when we get, again, I'll use the word, when we have a high experience, an elevated experience, a spiritual experience, if we can maintain a sense of humbleness, the humbleness is the fall. And so therefore we could still be on the roof and through humbleness experience a lowliness of spirit that protects us from falling off the roof. So here I'm going to introduce an idea that we're going to follow up on right now, is that there was something very, very positive that came out of the whole incident of the golden calf. And that is that the whole concept of tshuva was, in a sense, brought into the world. And in fact, the sages say that, and they asked the question, the same question I asked before, how could it be that only 40 days after all the good that God did for us, we panic because Moshe is, at least according to them, 6 hours late. According to Moshe, he wasn't late at all. But they thought he was a little bit late. And so the sages say, like, how could this generation have done such a sin like this? Or allowed, not everyone did it, but allowed this sin to happen. And so the sages answer, in order to show tshuva for the multitude. And here we don't have a case before this of all of Israel doing tshuva. And so the sages say that was the purpose of this sin happening. And so here, it's very similar to King David HaMelech. The whole sin with Bathsheba is, how does the whole story start? It says that David went up to the roof, and there he saw this beautiful woman bathing. That's how the whole incident begins. And both of them have something in common, and that is a lack of patience. David he saw immediately, this is his most essential soulmate. And it was true. In fact, they say that David and Bathsheba were meant for each other from the 6 days of creation. But David didn't have the patience to be intimate with her until it would work out that he could marry her in a kosher way. The same thing at Mount Sinai. The people didn't have the patience for Moshe to come down. They just threw up their hands just almost immediately and went and created a golden calf. And we see that the same thing in the Garden of Eden. We talked before about the parallels between the Garden of Eden, the receiving of the Torah, and the Mishkan. And here we're told that if Adam and Chava would have waited until Shabbat, they could have eaten first from the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, and then from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So then the question, and I'm going to add one more here, is when Yehuda ends up unknowingly sleeping with his daughter-in-law. And when it's found out that she's pregnant, he doesn't know that he thought he was with a prostitute. And when he wants to punish her, she had taken a surety from him, his staff and his signet. And so she sent these two signs to him and said, the one whose these are, that's who I'm pregnant from. And he realized it was from him. And so in the Torah, he says, Tzadka mimeni, she is more righteous than me. Only then did he realize what had happened. And Rashi brings an incredible tradition. He said two words, Tzadka mimeni, she is more righteous than me. Mimeni is from me. And Rashi says we can read this as two separate statements. Yehuda says, Tzadka, she's the righteous one. And a voice came from heaven and said, Mimeni, this whole incident comes from me. Why? Is because of that union comes the heritage that leads to King David, the birth of Peretz. Ultimately from Peretz comes Yishai, and from Yishai comes David, and from David comes the Mashiach. And so all of these cases of David, of Yehuda, of at Har Sinai, and actually Adam and Eve also, the classic question is, was it determined by God that these should happen? Because the sages say this happened in order to show tshuva, because Am Yisrael did tshuva. David HaMelech did tshuva. And we're told Adam and Chava did tshuva also. And so, was it destined to happen? Was it built into the system? Was it inevitable? Or were all of these incidents the consequences of choices that people made? So this, of course, is the classic question of the paradox of free will and divine omniscience and providence, that we believe in both of them. Many spiritual paths or religions or societies lean very strongly to one or the other. Either everything is divinely determined or nothing is divinely determined. It's all free will. There is no God. There is no directing providence in the universe. And Judaism believes very strongly in both of them. But then we have the paradox. How do they both work together? So there is a verse in the Psalms that says, Nora Alilah al Bnei Adam. The way it's usually translated is, awesome are the deeds of God in relation to human beings. And it's read in a very positive way, that God is awesome. God does such wonderful things for human beings. He gives us life. He gives us a planet that we can live on. He gives us a soul. He gives us the opportunity to be in the image of God. But there's another way to read this, which is the word, the way I translate is awesome are the deeds. Alilah are deeds. But in Hebrew, an alilah also means a libel. In Hebrew, a blood libel that the Jewish people suffered from for centuries. This idea that Jews take Christian and even seeped into the Muslim world, and we take blood from a Christian or Muslim child in order to make matzahs for Pesach. And this was called the blood libel. Thousands, tens of thousands of Jews died because of this. But it's the same word. And so some translate this, awesome is the libel that God did to human beings. In other words, the Garden of Eden was a setup. It was, again, whether it's a very fine line if we use the word inevitable that they would eat from the tree. It was programmed that even though they thought they had choice, really they didn't have choice, and that it was part of God's plan. It wasn't like God was doing evil, God forbid, but that it was a setup because ultimately they needed to leave the garden. Others hold no. It was pure free choice. That if they would have waited to Shabbos, they could have eaten from the tree of life, and only then the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So we have both, from the same verse, we could read it in both ways. Was it inevitable that the people would fall from the spiritual level of Mount Sinai and end up making a golden calf? Or was it total free will? That's what they decided to do. Or is there elements of both woven together? And if we look at our own lives and we with retrospect, so many times what appears to be forces beyond our control are really consequences of our own action. Or the opposite. Sometimes we think we're exercising our free will, and then later we understand how God was directing the whole thing. God was intervening. And so, in general, we believe very strongly that God does not intervene 24/7. That God has given over free will to human beings so that we could earn the right to be in the image of God. God is the ultimate chooser, the one who has ultimate free choice. And God wants that for human beings. But we know, we'll call it from miracles, that God does intervene. And we know that there's a bigger plan out there. And right now, just the last 120, 140 years, the return of the Jewish people to our homeland and the rebuilding of the cities, everything that the prophets prophesied that would happen is happening. And so we see that there is a divine plan, that there's divine direction, and that we all find our place in it. But the lines are so thin, so subtle between our exercising free choice and God directing, God pushing things forward. But there's a way that we could see how they work together. And this is based on a verse that we say in the Psalms every morning, part of the morning service. It says, Rabot machshavot belev ish, va'atzat Hashem hi takum. Many are the thoughts in the heart of a person. But it's God's, Eitzah literally means advice, but it's God's direction that stands. So the usual way that we read this is, I think that in Yiddish, man plans and God laughs. In other words, many are the thoughts in the heart of a person. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going here, we're going there, we're going to make this decision, we're going to make that decision. But ultimately, it's God who's going to decide what happens. That's the usual way we read this. But the other way we could read it, which is not opposite or different than this, but there is a subtle difference, is many are the thoughts in the heart of a person, and the person goes ahead and makes their choices, does what they do, but God is God. And no matter what choice we make, and you have to understand there's 8 billion people, and there's billions of galaxies, and every pinhead has millions of atoms, and God is on top of all of it. And so we make our choices, but there is a bigger plan. There is a bigger direction that all of creation is going in. And as soon as we make whatever decision we make, God is infinitely adaptable, will make it fit in to the bigger plan. So this is a way that we can understand that free will and God's determining how things will be can both be happening at the same time. Again, this doesn't take away the fact that God sometimes does intervene, that God does laugh when we plan, and we think we're going to do one thing, and God says, no, you're not. That's not what's going to happen here. That happens all the time, in fact. But in general, for our free will to be real free will, it must mean that God isn't pulling the strings like a marionette. But we know that God is involved, is intimately involved in our lives. And so here we could understand, there are many ways to see this, but we could see that when the sages say, how could it be that the people made a golden calf? And their answer is in order to show tshuva for the rabbim, for the multitudes. And the sense is that God allowed it to happen, directed it to happen, but we can understand people made their decisions. People did what they did. People are human. But what came out of it, God then, Atzat Hashem hi takum, what God wants to come out of it, that will come out of it. That's out of our hands. We'll make our decisions, but how they're crafted, how it fits into everything is many times out of our hands. And then the next verse afterwards says, Rabba machshavot b'lev ish. Many of the thoughts in the heart of a person, but it's God's eitzah, advice or directive that will be established. The next verse is Atzat Hashem leolam. God's eitzah, God's directing providence is forever. Leolam tamot, forever stands. Machshavot libo ledor vador. The thoughts of God's heart from generation to generation. In other words, we see our lives kind of like a horse with blinders. We don't see, I mean, we're aware that we're part of the Jewish people, and it's 3,000 years old, and many of us are aware that we're not here for the first time, that we've been here many times before, but we don't always have this consciousness of understanding all of history, all of creation at every moment. But here it says that the providence of God stands forever, the thoughts of his heart from generation to generation. So we see, kind of like with blinders, what's happening now, but God is seeing the whole picture from the very beginning, from even before the beginning. And so we can't even contemplate that. We can do our best. But these are just questions that are brought up with the statement of the sages that that the sin happened. They didn't come and say the sin was of course it was a mistake, a sin, a horrible sin with terrible consequences. But they answer, and it happened, and God made it that it brought tshuva into the world. Because right after this, as part of the tshuva process, God reveals to Moshe the 13 milot rachamim, the 13 aspects of compassion. So a tremendous thing came out of this. It's not like we chose that we'd have to have such a terrible descent through a sin in order to bring tshuva in the world. But God made it that that's what came out of it. So now I just want to add just one last idea here, and that is, excuse me. And that is to try to understand a little bit what was the headspace of the people that they turned to making a golden calf. Here, I'm not getting into, was it the Erev Rav, how much of Israel was involved in it, the numbers, who instigated. According to tradition, the main fault falls on the Erev Rav, but there's no doubt that some from Israel followed this as well. But here, what happened was, and one of the Living with the Times this week is going to explore this in greater depth. But when Moshe didn't show up on time, they panicked. They fell into fear, and they fell into uncertainty. We all know what kind of thoughts and actions can come from falling into a state of fear or a state of instability. I don't know what's going to be here. And that's what they said about Moshe. Lo yadanu, we don't know what happened to him. We need someone to lead us. So this is far from a justification, but we're just trying to understand the headspace. They were in a state of panic, fear, uncertainty, and this is what's discussed in Living with the Times. Their imaginations went wild, and they just lost it. They lost all perspective, and they were grabbing for some sense of stability. This is really the voice of Amalek. We've learned before that Amalek, the chief enemy of the Jewish people throughout all the ages, is the gematria of Safek, of doubt. And so here people fell into a state of doubt. And you could hear Amalek saying, Moshe is not coming back. And in fact, showed a picture in the clouds that appeared to be Moshe's coffin, and the people's imaginations went wild. And so, so what happened here? They were grabbing for some experience that would give them a sense of stability. Now, they needed to do something. They felt they needed to do something instead of just simply saying, maybe he's a little bit late. let's wait. That's what Aaron said. Aaron said, he's coming back. But they wouldn't listen. And according to tradition, Hur tried to, one of the great tzaddikim, tried to stop the people, and they killed him. So Aaron was in a very compromised position now. Okay, this we're not getting into right now, but the idea was they were looking for some way to get out of doubt, to alleviate the fear of the unknown. What are we going to do without Moshe? And so this is like a repeat of what happened in the Garden of Eden, where the tree of knowledge of good and evil represents the idea of experience, knowledge that is based on experience. And that's why God said, don't eat from the tree. And really between the lines was, until you've eaten from the tree of life. The tree of life is the Torah. If we are grounded morally, ethically, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically in the wisdom of the Torah, then we can filter experience in a correct way. And we're told that it wasn't that they just built a golden calf. It turned into a whole orgy. Rashi tells us that actually some of those involved, what they were looking for is to break down all the moral standards. And that's why when Moshe came back and he saw them dancing and singing around the golden calf, that's when he broke the luchot. It wasn't just that they were worshiping the golden calf. They were like beyond. They had lost all perspective, and they were being involved in an orgy. So here, again, experience came before the Torah. Had they waited for Moshe to bring down the Torah, they never, ever would have worshipped a golden calf. It never would have happened. And so here it's very connected to what happened in Gan Eden. We're even told, the Midrash says that if Moshe would have come down with the first luchot were written with the finger of God. We're told that death would have been abolished. When did death come into the world? As a consequence of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we're told that here, if they would have received the Torah, they would have been able to fix the sin of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But again, they fell into the trap. They didn't have the patience, and they went for experience first. David also, he sees Bathsheba's my soulmate from the 6 days of creation. And instead of waiting according to the strictures of the Torah, he got involved with the experience of intimate relations with Bathsheba. So there's deep connections here between receiving the Torah and Gan Eden, and as we said in the beginning, with the Mishkan also, many of the symbolisms of the Mishkan. So we should be blessed. We should be blessed that we can do our part by holding on to the Torah, we can help fix this sin of the golden calf, of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and bring true redemption to the world.